Everybody, welcome to session 113 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. Dr. Derek Reed joins me today to discuss the behavioral economic principles that underpin so much of what we're seeing today as the world attempts to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. From buying all the toilet paper in sight to heeding, or perhaps not heeding, government guidelines for social distancing, Derek relates these behavioral patterns to some very basic operant principles. We start the show with a quick overview of three key behavioral economic terms: delayed discounting, probability discounting, and behavioral economic demand. We then talk about how these processes can be used to interpret some of the fascinating societal behavior that we're seeing all around us, including, of course, the panic buying of toilet paper. Derek then goes on to describe some of the research that he's done in this area and suggests some lines for future endeavors. We also discuss some of the shortcomings of traditional ABA research designs in studying these phenomena, along with what we can do to overcome these barriers. Derek brought up several references throughout this conversation, and as always, I've done my best to track them down in the show notes, so you can just find those at behavioralobservations.com. Today's episode is sponsored by Behavior University. Behavior University's mission is to provide university-quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Learn about their CEU offerings and podcast-specific discounts over at behavioruniversity.com/observations. I'm also happy to promote the Verbal Behavior Conference, which we talked about at length in the last episode, and will be soldiering on in a webinar format. While I was looking forward to visiting Austin, I'm glad the event is still going on, regardless of location. The event will feature speakers such as David Palmer, Barbara Esch, Pat McGreevy, and more, and they've kindly asked me to moderate the panel at the end of the first day. So if this sounds like fun to you, go to ctac1.com/podcast, where you can register at a discounted rate. That's ctac1.com/podcast. And again, all these links will be in the show notes. So this is usually the part where I say, hey, without any further delay, let's get to this conversation with fill in the blank guest. I'll get to that in a second, but first, I just have to acknowledge a couple things. This COVID-19 crisis is really quite unprecedented. It's not only causing disruptions in our daily lives, but it's clearly causing interruptions in service delivery on a massive scale. At the same time, many ABA providers are struggling just to keep their doors open. And there's no getting around the fact that people are scared, people are stressed, and people are worried. I'm not going to go into unsolicited advice-giving mode, as I think we all have to find our own solutions based on our individual needs and circumstances. When you really think about it, that's not really a novel concept for us behavior analysts, right? That said, I do have this kind of optimistic feeling that we will get through this, and perhaps one silver lining is that I'm guessing we'll see many examples of ingenious problem-solving from our colleagues. So let's stay positive and think through these challenges like behavior analysts. Okay, so now, without any further delay, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Derek Reed.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Derek Reed, thanks for coming back for another appearance on the Behavioral Observations podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, considering. How about yourself?
We're doing well here in the Sikoria household in this era of social isolation. I think distancing may be perhaps too kind of a word.
Yeah,
and plus, I'm just
agree.
getting sick of saying social distancing by now. I don't know, or at least reading it or hearing it on the news. So, you were very, very kind in agreeing to come on the show. I mean, one of the first things I thought about, especially when you started seeing things like toilet paper disappearing from stores and things like that, my mind immediately went to behavioral economics. And of course, when I think of behavioral economics, I think of, there's only a handful of folks that come to mind. You're one of them. And I thought, hey, you know what? Let me see if Derek has some time to come back on the show and talk about this. And when I reached out to you, you were like, hell yeah, there's lots of stuff that applies here. I'm paraphrasing, of course.
Absolutely.
So thanks for coming back on the show. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here.
So for those who are newer to the show, Derek is an OG guest. He was on the show way back in session 17. can't believe it's been that long. I think it was probably like what 2016 or so is around the
Yep.
time that and here we are, 4 years later. Um, and so if you want to, we'll reference that episode here and there. So we're going to get into some topics uh, around behavioral economics and throw around some terminology. If you want a real deeper dive in that, then and if you haven't caught it, or if it's been a while since you've listened to it, go back and listen to session 17, and you can get caught up and also hear a little bit more about who Derek is and his background and things like that. We'll get into a little bit of that here, but again, for a little bit more information, that would serve as a good primer, as Chris Newland would say, or pronounce it as. So anyway, so having before we get into the real hardcore kind of COVID-19 behavioral economics, I guess, mashup discussion, let's just take a moment. I'm just curious, what's been new with you, Derek? How's life been in the last couple of years?
Last couple of years have been pretty fast and furious. We adopted a little boy 2 years ago, and happened at ABAI, so we had to fly home from the convention early,
Oh, wow.
which was that was a trip. So we just thrust into parenthood very quickly, and it's been very, very fun. Obviously, it's changed how much you can do professionally and put some priorities in place, which is great. So that's been a bulk of my responsibilities since then. But professionally, there's been some really cool changes at KU. We started the Coffin Logan Center for Addiction Research and Treatment, and that's housed in the building that houses our department, Applied Behavioral Science. And so Dr. Richard Yee, he's a behavior analyst and a behavioral economist, and he's the director of that center. So he came on board to help run that. And one of the first things we did was set up a bar lab, which could be a fun topic for a future episode. So it's a legit bar. We actually have permission from the university to administer alcohol, and there's only 7 other ones in the country. And so we can actually begin to look at stimulus effects of alcohol cues on behavior and start to validate some of these hypothetical things that we do in behavioral economics by actually having actual purchasing of alcohol. So that's on the horizon. So that's all ready to go. We just have to start the research at this point.
You just need people on campus now.
Right. Yeah. I just need to be allowed back on campus. We just found out today that campus is shut down for the rest of the semester. So unfortunately, that research is at a standstill, but it'll be there this summer, hopefully.
I see. Well, if I ever make my way out there, I'll happily, test it out to make sure it works okay. Go. So, I just, we'll have to see the craft beer list ahead of time, maybe make some suggestions, or maybe bring some things from New England. So, that's super cool. And you, just got a promotion, right?
Yeah. I'm going up for full professor. And so it just needs to be rubber stamped by the chancellor at this point. So I will be a full professor starting in August.
That's super cool. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Lots of cool stuff. And it all happened after appearing on the Behavioral Observations podcast.
It wouldn't have happened otherwise.
That's right. I mean, let's not go so far. Correlation does not mean causation, of course, but I just wanted to, it's just one data point, I mean, who knows? So anyway,
no, I attribute it to that. So.
All right. All right. Well, long story short, lots of cool things happening in your life. And so thanks for bringing us up to speed. So there's so much to dig into here, and lots of potential rabbit holes. So I'll try my best to kind of stay on track a little bit. Where I thought would be a good place to start would be to go through maybe some terms here before we start talking about the applications. And 3 of them you suggested included just the general concept of delayed discounting, probability discounting, and behavioral economic demand. So can you just kind of walk us through and give a kind of like a layman's description of each one of those? And then that way we'll be on the same kind of, same footing, if you will.
Sure. So delay discounting is a behavioral process that we observe when people make decisions between a larger later and a smaller sooner reinforcer. And people delay discount when they will forego a larger, later reinforcer in preference for a smaller, sooner one. So as delays become high and long, then people will kind of go towards a preference for a smaller reward. And this is modeled in EAB with rats, with pigeons, doing actual consumption procedures where they can peck on a key and there'll be an immediate small amount of grain for a pigeon, or they can peck on the second key and that will produce a waiting period in which they'll get larger amounts of grain. And when you manipulate the delays, what you see is this sort of hyperbolic discounting curve that emerges. And that started in the mid 1980s, being looked at in the non-human literature specifically. And then since then, there's been some human analogs that have developed, and that's kind of where my research has gone. So just hypothetically asking people, would you rather have $50 now or $100 in a month or in 2 months? And looking at that point at which we switch from that larger later to the smaller sooner reinforcer. And what we see with delay discounting is that discounting curve, so the rate at which you lose that value of the larger later reinforcer, is associated with all sorts of health problems and risky decisions. And that's kind of where my research comes in.
Okay, so can I just pause
yeah.
you right there? So just to make sure I'm on the same page. So to the extent to which you take the sooner, smaller reward is correlated with a behavioral repertoire that doesn't portend well, I guess, for the individual organism.
That would be a good way to frame it. Yeah. So Warren Bickel has actually proposed this as a trans disease process. And so this delay discounting seems to be a root of a lot of health decisions, whether it's substance uses such as smoking or drinking alcohol, cocaine use, all the way to things like not using a safety belt in your vehicle, to indoor tanning, and all sorts of things that have negative life consequences. And what we see is that if you are a steep delay discounter with, say, money, then you're more likely to engage in lots of those risky health decisions. And so it's not just related to like one thing. It's just sort of larger repertoire of risky decisions. And so it's a way to kind of tap into that behaviorally in a survey format, which is very convenient. We can talk more about that later. But what all these behavioral economic principles we're going to talk about, I think it's important to note, these aren't surveys per se. And I know there's a misconception about that. These are data that we collect and we do a parametric evaluation of delays. So, how much would you take now versus a month versus, when it's a year delayed. And we repeatedly ask an individual those questions. And then we plot a curve to that. So these discount rates that we get, we consider them higher order variables. So they're data points that we only get through a behavioral measurement. It's not like you're just asking someone, what is your discount rate? So that self-report aspect of it, we're always uncomfortable with that as behavior analysts. I'm uncomfortable with that as a behavior analyst, but the data seem to suggest that whether it's hypothetical versus real, people's discount rates are equivalent. And the same equations that model a non-human's behavior model a human's behavior. And so we tend to view this as a good analog to actual human behavior, but it's not a substitute for assessing real human behavior. And so we can talk a little bit more about that later on as well. But this is a convenient way to study things that you couldn't necessarily study in the operant lab. So things like cocaine use, there's ethical considerations, or risky sexual behavior. These aren't things we can actually offer as real consequences. So it kind of takes that operant behavioral analysis off the table. But through these procedures that we've developed and validated, we can still have a rooted behavioral economic measurement system that's based on EAB that tends to get us the same data. And so it's pretty fortunate in that regard.
I see. So with regard to this idea of trans disease process, is that the term?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think we've all known people I've known people through life and whatnot who just seem super impulsive and not only do they tend to, maybe drink a lot or whatever, they also tend to impulse buy and make impulse purchases and things like that. So it seems kind of it's kind of like shot through their. I know we're not comfortable with these types of terms, but
Sure.
they have that kind of colloquially described as a addictive personality. Is that pretty much what Dr. Bickle's getting at?
Essentially, yeah, without calling it a personality and trying to
Right,
avoid,
yeah. Just trying to use everyday terms but
yeah,
we all know those
exactly.
people, right?
Exactly, and it maps on really well to that. And so it does. In substance use literature, there is discussion of addictive personalities, and this seems to kind of corroborate that, but with a behavioral foundation. So yeah, I think that's definitely right there. And I know we're going to talk about demand in a moment, as well as probability discounting, but what has also been proposed by behavioral economists is that at the root of a lot of risky health decisions, and specifically with substance use disorder, is something that we call a reinforcement pathology. And this has kind of been a term that's been developed by behavioral economists. It's a way to have a common language with medical professionals because they want to look for pathologies. And this is a way to kind of bring it back into behavior analysis by talking about issues like delay discounting or excessive behavioral economic demand for a commodity. And so the theory is if you've got really steep delay discounting and excessive demand for a certain substance of abuse, those two things interacting are considered a reinforcement pathology. And that reinforcement pathology model seems to account for a lot of risky decision-making profiles in substance use disorder, for example. So it's a way to kind of conceptualize health behavior in a behavior analytic framework by using terminology that medical professionals would get, but still kind of staying true to behaviorism. So it's kind of a convenient use of language by behavior analysts.
Okay. And so we've got the delay discounting. And so, and I think that's something that folks can conceptualize pretty easily. So what about probability discounting? You mentioned a second ago. So do you want to kind of delve into that a little bit more?
Yeah. So delay discounting was pretty much the first form of discounting that behavior analysts started to study. And one of the critiques or one of the assumptions was that perhaps people are choosing smaller, sooner rewards because delayed consequences become probabilistic. So are you sure that 20 years from now you're going to get that $100 from the researcher? Probably not sure. So it becomes a probabilistic sort of outcome. And so with delay discounting, you've got this really interesting setup where you've got something immediately versus something projected into the future. And behavior analysis is not really well suited to studying future behavior. We have to look at consequences. We don't know the consequences of future behavior. Probability discounting brings things both to the present. So probability discounting will look at whether or not you would take a small amount of money for certain right now or a larger uncertain amount of money right now. So you can make a gamble essentially. So you can think of this as, you can have $50 right now, or I can give you a 20% chance of getting $400 right now. Which would you rather have? And so we can start to analyze how people make decisions with respect to that. And what we find is that as we manipulate the probability of the larger reward, it follows the same sort of curve as a delay discounting curve. And so it begs the question, are these the same thing? And so some interesting research from Todd McKercher and Len Green have suggested that these are not the same process. They're very similar. The curves look similar. They're correlated, but they are not the same process. So people kind of make decisions with delays and probabilities distinctly, but it kind of looks the same behaviorally, if that makes sense. And so probability discounting is very helpful to understand uncertain consequences or probabilistic reinforcement schedules and how we devalue uncertainty.
Would that be like some of your, the tanning salon stuff that you've done where like and you can perhaps describe that in a second, but like, or someone who smokes, it's like, well, I may get cancer or I may get lung disease, but
yeah. And
so the reinforcer right now is the more important than
Yeah.
the potential the probabilistic negative outcome of some sort of health problem.
Yeah. So, you got dopamine firing when you're consuming a reinforcer, and that happens instantly. Or you've got this uncertain, very delayed health consequence. And that's going to have some bearing on, as we talk about COVID-19. I think that's where this really comes into play, is that we know consequences right now. We know probability of certain behaviors right now are certain. We know exactly what's going to happen. But as we project into the future, not only is it delayed, but it's probabilistic. And so those two things interacting really pronounce discounting. So risky health decisions, it's typically, small, certain reinforcement right now versus a larger, delayed, and probabilistic future. And that makes decisions very problematic. And so when those things are kind of interacting, it's not a surprise that people are making risky decisions in the present sense. And so I think that helps explain a lot of human behavior when you think about it.
Would that also apply? So we're thinking of like smoking as perhaps a behavior would like to decelerate,
Right.
and would want to avoid the long-term negative consequence of that. Does that also would that also apply to, say, like exercising, meaning that we might choose not to exercise because guess what? Sometimes
Right.
some people like to exercise, but very often for folks it's very effortful. There's lots of it's difficult. You have to get up in the morning, whatever. I'm just making. There's a lot of things that get in the way of exercising and prevents it from happening. And then the probability of me being at the same weight I was when I graduated from high school, is
Right.
low.
Right.
Does it work in that regard too?
Yeah. And again, with health decisions, I mean, this is just the nature of our decision making. Like, I could smoke a cigarette right now, and I know that I'm going to get this instant, nicotine reaction, or I can choose to refrain in the hopes that 30 years down the road, I don't have lung cancer. And so, those things kind of outweigh the present small amount outweighs that probabilistic delayed outcome. And so that becomes a problem. And so what one of my students did, Brent Kaplan, he's now Dr. Brent Kaplan at University of Kentucky. He, for his master's thesis, actually looked at ways that we can change delay and probabilistic discounting of health conditions. And the literature suggests that if you make the future a little bit more salient, so it's like behavior analytic time travel. So it's a little outside of what we typically would do in EAB or ABA. But we took some literature from the cognitive decision-making literature, and we found that people were doing age-progressed pictures. And so we would bring undergraduates into the lab and have them do a delayed and probabilistic discounting assessment. So there's a hobby you engage in right now. You really enjoy it, but you find out that there's a 20% chance that this will give you cancer after X delay. And so we did a series of these to figure out how they make these, kind of cancer avoiding decisions. And then we took pictures of them, age progressed them to age 65 using some computer programming, some gaming software that you create avatars for games. And so we made them look old, and we had them write a little vignette about what their life will be like at age 65. And then they would come into the lab, they would read that, they'd look at their future self in the face, literally on the computer screen. And then we would have them do the same decision-making probability and delay discounting tasks. And we found that they improved their decision-making. We did a multiple baseline. So we actually used more ABA sort of measurement for this, and did repeated measurement. So they did this repeatedly over repeated sessions. And we found that when they saw their future self and read that vignette, it actually improved their delay and probability discounting. So that, there's a way that we can actually have people think about the future, whether it's what we call episodic future thinking. So that's kind of projecting yourself into that future situation, Or there's something called explicit zero framing. So if I say, would you rather have $50 right now or $100 in 2 years? That may be a hard decision, but what I can also do is say, would you rather have $50 right now and not $100 in 2 years? Or would you rather have $100 in 2 years and not $50 right now? And we see that that actually changes decision-making as well. So it's a way to kind of make the decisions a little bit more concrete. And, you know, you're basically controlling verbal behavior at that point. You're controlling their self-report by manipulating other forms of verbal behavior. So it's really compatible, I think, with Skinnerian verbal behavior, but I don't think we have a full grasp on what those verbal operants are that we're kind of manipulating there. But they're pretty powerful techniques. And, you know, it begs the question, how realistic is that in the real world? How often do you actually have these sort of consequences? But investment bankers do this sort of thing when they sit down and someone's creating their risk portfolio and they set up their 401k. That's one way that you can get them to choose a better future outcome, is to talk about like what they will do to your paycheck right now versus in the future, and so on. So there is some real world kind of views of that.
I see. Yeah. I remember going through many surveys along those lines when I was getting some financial advising. So yeah, definitely remember doing stuff like that. So, all right, cool. That's and then so as it relates to behavioral economic demand.
Sure. So demand is kind of the other side of the reinforcement pathologies model. So this is how much motivation you have to consume a reinforcer. So our kind of textbook definition of demand is it's an organism's willingness to defend its baseline consumption. So if I gave you, free access to a reward or a reinforcer, how much of it would you have? Now, if I start putting constraints on it, so I increase the number of lever presses or math problems you have to do, how much will you increase your behavior to maintain that same rate of consumption? And so this comes out of Steve Hirsch's work in the 70s and early 80s, where he was trying to bridge the gap between microeconomic theory and behavioral psychology. And he found that a lot of work in behavioral pharmacology, where we're manipulating unit price of, say, a drug, so getting access to an administration of a drug by increasing lever presses, it actually follows something called the demand curve. And then if you've ever taken intro to economics or just Google demand curve, this is not a behavior analysis idea. This is what every economist knows about. So kind of the law of supply and demand: as prices go up, consumption goes down. And so what he found was that these behavior analytic studies kind of followed that. And so that kind of spurred this whole line of research into manipulating effort and cost requirements for reinforcers, and then showing that it follows these same sort of demand models. And so this kind of was popularized in behavioral pharmacology because it had a lot of relation to drug policies as those were getting developed, and the government funded a lot of that work. But now, as it's evolved, we started to use this to understand basically the abuse liability of any commodity that is dangerous. So I've used behavioral economic demand curves to look at ultraviolet indoor tanning. We've talked about that before. So it's not necessarily a drug. One could make an argument that it could be, but this is a way to understand basically how consumers make decisions with relation to financial constraints. And so if you want to get really meta with it, you could actually conceptualize delay discounting as demand, where the cost is time. It's not necessarily a button press, but it's time. So they're compatible in that regard. And so again, we can do this in the lab experientially, where you could have people press a computer button several times to earn a point. Or we can do it where we ask people, how many cigarettes would you have if they were free? How many would you have if they were $1? How many would you buy if they were $5? And what we see when we do that is that, just like delay discounting, real and hypothetical seem to correlate very well. They both are correlated with the same real world indicators of problems. And when we do incentivized tasks, where we say you could actually experience one of your consequences. So one of these choices that you make, you will have to experience. You could do that with delay discounting, or you could do that with demand. And what happens is, when it's incentivized, people tend to have the same discounting and demand curves as if it was purely hypothetical. So it suggested that verbal self-report is pretty accurate, with them kind of tacting their own reinforcement history. And as behavior analyst, that's how I interpret responses on these. As you're framing it and anchoring it to what you've already done, and you can report on how many cigarettes you've bought if you're a cigarette smoker at various costs, and you can kind of gauge that. And so one of my colleagues, Michael Amlung, he's going to be starting at KU in August, actually, coming from McMaster in Hamilton, Ontario. He actually did a bar lab study with incentivized demand for alcohol versus purely hypothetical demand for alcohol, and found that those were equivalent. And so again, that's some extra validity to what we're doing. And so those, framing behavior under behavioral economics, we typically use discounting, whether it's delay or probability, or demand, or the interaction of those two within that reinforcement pathologies model. And so that's kind of the way I approach risky behavior. And, so when you contacted me about my thoughts on COVID-19 and whether or not discounting or behavioral economics was involved, this is all I've been thinking about for the past month or so. And so I think there's a lot of things that we can kind of extrapolate from.
Are you in need of continuing education? Well, Behavior University is a BACB approved continuing ed provider, and their mission is to provide university quality courses and ABA for new and experienced professionals alike. Their live webinars generally have a limited number of attendees so that the learning experience is highly interactive. And if you can't make the live events, these webinars are recorded and available in Behavior University's CEU library for later viewing. Behavior University also has a 40-hour Rbt Training. This self-paced course uses a combination of visual presentation, audio lectures, and live video models to teach all areas of the Rbt task list. The course is accessible anytime and from anywhere. So if you'd like to learn more, head on over to behavioruniversity.com/observations, where you'll find a 10% discount for podcast listeners. Again, that's behavioruniversity.com/observations, and thanks for checking them out. All right, well, so let's get into it then. What there's a couple different directions we can go, I suppose, and all the inspiration we need is to just flip on the news for a minute, or go to CNN.com or something like that, or whatever your preferred news source is, and you see people clearing the grocery store shelves of toilet paper, of all things, and other supplies, and then the whether or not people heed the advice of authorities with regard to the social distancing recommendations and things like that. So let's take a couple of these, and if you can kind of walk us through how these concepts apply. Sure. I think that would be helpful for the audience. Let's start with. Let's just start with the toilet paper thing, because it's so absurd. Like it's not even as if I don't know. I don't know what people are imagining they're going to do with all this, but.
Right. Well, so toilet paper demand is. This is going to sound really weird until I explain it, of a personal interest to me, because, and I know that sounds weird, we actually started doing toilet paper demand research about 5 or 6 years ago in my lab. And so we have years of data on this.
Okay. What was the inspiration for that?
Well, all right. So the way we assess demand in behavior economic research is through purchase tasks. We ask people, how much of this commodity would you buy at this price? And so we don't have a lot of access to substance users on campus. And so some of the things we want to do is kind of explore general population level sort of things. And so as the purchase task literature started to come out and people started to refine this method, it became necessary to look at how we can manipulate that purchase task with any commodity to just understand basic behavioral economic manipulations, like whether it's an open economy versus a closed economy, meaning do you have access to this reinforcer outside the lab or not? Or if you have a substitute available. So for instance, what's your demand for Pepsi when Coke is available as a substitute soda? And so we wanted to find something that anyone in the public would consume. And we basically arrived, we looked at bottled water, but not everyone drinks bottled water. And so at the end of the day, we were like, well, toilet paper seems to be a commodity that no matter what your personal interests or preferences are, you buy toilet paper. And so we wanted to have a commodity that we could put on Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a crowdsourcing platform to do surveys with people all over the country, and you pay them. And so we wanted something that we could put out there. It doesn't matter if you use certain drugs. We're not looking at that. We're just looking at kind of how these purchase tasks work. And so toilet paper seemed to work. And then one of our colleagues, Dr. Peter Roma, who was at Institutes for Behavior Resources, or at the time, now he is at NASA doing the Human Performance Lab stuff. He actually developed a paper, so it's Roma, Hirsch, and Hudja, I think it's 2016, where they did a bunch of real world commodities, and they actually included toilet paper in that study as well. And so there's actually a lot of data on this. It's a great thing to be able to validate purchase tasks because we can look at how consumers make decisions. You could ask literally any consumer about their demand for toilet paper, and they have some experience buying it. And so it's, it seems like a joke, but it actually has a lot of real world sense. So the first thing that went here in Lawrence, Kansas, when COVID-19 scare kind of broke out last week, is people went to the grocery store and bought all the toilet paper and hand sanitizer. I'll add that too. But it is interesting because the virus does not cause anything that would increase your demand for toilet paper. So,
exactly.
Yeah, and so it kind of begs the question: why are people doing this? And so what we've been talking about thus far is operant behavioral economics. So this idea that we're looking at antecedents, consequences, a very behavior analytic framework to consumer decisions. People have to recognize there's also an entire other field of behavioral economics. It's probably 10 times the size of ours. And that's kind of pop behavioral economics. And that's, if you read the book Nudge or Predictably Irrational, these are very popular ideas. And so behavioral economics outside of behavior analysis is all about cognitive biases. So these kind of heuristics or decision-making profiles that people have that they don't really explain why they're there. These aren't behavior analysts. These are cognitive psychologists or social psychologists who do this work. So they're approaching it differently than we would. So they come up with these things called cognitive biases. And this is something that we haven't really started to understand in behavior analysis. But one of them is zero risk bias. And it's this idea that you will, at the expense of doing something that makes sense, you will eliminate a risk because it makes you feel better. And so I've read some things that this kind of toilet paper craze is a zero risk bias. It's some way to make people feel like they're in control. You don't know what you're going to need in the social isolation world that we're all entering, but you do know you're going to need toilet paper, and you're going to need enough of it in case you never have to leave for 2 months or whatever. And so that's one way that people can kind of escape that sort of anxiety of preparedness. So I think of this like a negative reinforcement sort of contingency of like, I feel stressed right now. I feel anxious. I don't know what the future holds. At least I know I have toilet paper.
So is it like if you have to go teach a class and it's 90 minutes long, you go to the bathroom before the class, even if you don't really have to, because you don't.
Yeah. I mean,
there's a term for that I'm not gonna share on air, but
right. Right.
But you go for a car ride or whatever,
Yeah, and something like preparing for class is a really good metaphor here, or kind of example, because what you should be doing in that time is reading your notes or whatever. So it comes at the expense of better preparedness. You canceling out completely some risk comes at the cost of better relative risk preparedness. That's what zero risk bias is. And so that's what's happening here. People are spending a lot of money and spending a lot of time going out all over town buying toilet paper when they could be spending time with their family or cooking extra meals or whatever the case might be, that actually is probably better to do. But at least with toilet paper, you're canceling out the risk that you're going to need toilet paper.
I actually read an article.
I buy that.
Yeah. It's funny. Before we hit record, we're talking about contrarians, and I actually read a very contrarian, or just read the few first paragraphs or so of a contrarian article about like the case for price gouging.
Right.
And so the idea that if you jack the price up on some of these commodities that people would otherwise snap up, that you actually preserve their presence on the shelves for those who truly need them. I'm sure there's arguments both sides, but it was at least something that I, previous to seeing that article, hadn't been an argument I hadn't been acquainted with at the time. But
yeah. I mean, that's an interesting debate, and it's rooted in behavioral economics. It's a demand curve. Like, you increase the cost until people don't buy it, and so. I think that could be a whole topic for another show, I think. But I do see some relevance here, and I think that nicely kind of explains what's going on. I can't think of anything straightforward in behavior analysis that would explain this sort of rush on toilet paper purchasing. And I think that highlights something that kind of irks me to the core, and this is kind of my soapbox I always get on, is that behavior analysis has been kind of stuck in its ways, and these other areas have really taken off. So this idea of cognitive biases, a lot of people buy into that. I mean, and on just face validity, it makes sense, and that's why it's so popular. But when you sit down and try to figure out, like, well, what is that behaviorally, I draw a blank, and maybe I'm just not sophisticated enough with conceptual behavior analysis or verbal behavior, relational frame theory, to be able to adequately explain that. But I think what we need to do is come up with experimental analogs of these things and put it into the lab so that we can figure it out. If you do a search and try to find EAB studies on cognitive biases, they don't exist. And so you can only kind of patch together some ideas to try to help make sense of this. And I think that's a mistake. And I think that, it's a missed opportunity for us. And here's another instance of something, very popular in the news and in kind of like pop psychology blogs, and behavior analysis doesn't have the seat at the table because we haven't taken the time to try to understand something that's pretty complicated. So anyways.
That makes sense. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think just any of these behaviors that seem irrational, having an explanation as to why otherwise very educated and smart people are doing. Like I have some friends of mine, and they want to go like take out large sums of cash from the bank.
Yeah.
And I know there's a whole, like, during economic, I mean, obviously the economy is kind of in a spiral, but it's it's not like a run on the bank situation, or at least I don't think. I hope we don't play this podcast back in a few years and be like, oh boy, were they wrong. But there are situations like that where perhaps that might be not a rational thing to do, but an understandable thing to do. Like, if you fear a bank that is going under and you've got, X amount of money in it, but obviously it's one of those things, if everyone does it, then the whole thing falls apart. But yeah, it's just interesting to see these sorts of things. And I've had, since I posted the call for questions for this interview, I've had people send me, pictures of grocery stores and Walmarts and Targets that are all just, with shelves that are just completely blown out and empty and things like that. So, I know we had a couple other examples we want to talk about here. Let me look at my list. So what about, following so we have the demand for commodities covered.
Sure.
We have this other consideration of adhering to these kind of social distancing guidelines. And then I remember seeing someone posted something on Facebook the other night of like, schools have been closed, people have been told to work from home and things like that. And then there was a picture of Bourbon Street, and it was just mobbed, it was just, shoulder to shoulder people. And later on, they eventually cleared it out, but there are pictures of people at the beach, and not in here in New Hampshire, of course, but
Right.
but much more hospitable climates. And people driving by shops and bars and restaurants, and now I think at the time of this recording this on the 17th of March, at least in New Hampshire, I know in a lot of surrounding states and things like that, the government is cracking down on that. And I think here in New Hampshire, restaurants can only provide takeout.
Right.
But up until then, the opportunity to mingle and to not heed those recommendations for social distancing were in many cases not being followed, particularly not being followed by by young folks who are walking around perhaps having COVID-19 and being asymptomatic, which is the challenging thing. So can you walk us through how you look at this stuff from the behavioral economic lens, at least as it relates to following those recommendations from public health authorities?
Yeah. So one of the common denominators between operant behavioral economics and more of the pop psychology, behavioral economics, is this idea of prospect theory. And it's this idea that losses control behavior more than gains. And actually some of the work from Chris Newland's lab has shown that if you look at matching law and you've got, punishment on one side versus reinforcement on another, like punishment can control behavior differently than reinforcement. And so prospect theory is all about kind of avoiding risk, and this idea that humans evolved to be risk averse. And it makes sense that people who are more risk averse were more likely to survive and pass on their genetics and so forth. And so you see that happen in things like the matching law, or if you compare reinforcement versus punishment in maybe applied token economy studies, and especially in behavioral economics. When we look at delay discounting, there's a whole literature on discounting of gains versus discounting of losses. And so it kind of works the same way, where would you rather lose $50 now versus lose $50 in the future? And what you see is that discounting looks different between those two, and that people discount, they're more risk averse when you start putting the losses in. And so people are making better decisions to avoid losing the money. And so that's interesting, and that's interesting to me. And so we actually did a study a couple of years ago. It just came out. It's coming out this year, looking at tornado warning messages, and it's kind of leveraging this idea. And it was using delay discounting, so a delay until a tornado strikes your town, and the warning is either describing the tornado or using graphic language. And it turns out the National Weather Service actually does that. They have these graphic warnings that they started doing after the Joplin tornado, and they use things like catastrophic loss of life. And what we saw in our data is that people made better, safer decisions when you made that risk a little bit more apparent. And so when I think about what's going on right now, I'm just curious to see how this all unfolds. And one thing I've been really interested in is this idea that we're describing mild versus severe cases of COVID-19. And when you look at it, a mild case of COVID-19 can actually include pneumonia. A severe case just means that you're on a ventilator, a respirator. And so that's the difference. And so I don't think people realize that. So when we say people who are younger, they might have more mild cases of this. So people view that as it'll be like the flu. Well, no, the pneumonia is more than the flu. And so that use of language is interesting to me. And so we are actually running a study on Amazon Mechanical Turk right now on COVID-19 decision-making. So we're looking at demand for toilet paper. We're looking at demand for hand sanitizer. We're also doing comparison commodities like paper towels versus hand lotion. And what we want to see is when we assess these same people a year from now, assuming this is all calmed down, that demand for hand lotion or paper towels looks the same as it does right now, but these other commodities like hand sanitizer and toilet paper are excessively demanded right now, but they won't be in the future. And that'll help validate purchase tasks. One of the things we're also doing in there is having people make decisions about going to a large social gathering. We have them imagine that they've recently bought tickets to this, $50, so it's kind of a sunk cost and canceling. Now, we started this last week, so this is before, I think that context matters, because now any of these sort of things that we're describing would be shut down by local health departments. So we have to stop data collection today because it's just context matters. And so the idea is someone in your county has presented with symptoms. There's this % chance that they are present at this event. How likely are you to still go? And what we did was we described the symptoms to the participants. And so people either got mild versus severe, or they got mild and severe within subject, but then half the participants had it just listed with the symptoms without the terms mild and severe. And so it turns out that the mild, so the use of the term mild actually increases the likelihood that people will still go to this event. And so it kind of follows what we saw with the tornado discounting, but now this is extremely relevant. So if we say there's a risk that you'll get mild COVID-19, people are more likely to make a riskier health decision. That's a huge problem. And the effects are very, very small that we're seeing so far. We have 180 participants so far. The effects are pretty small. However, when you start to extrapolate that to population level and you think about hundreds of millions of adults in the United States, that's a problem. So if we have a 20% difference, for instance, in whether or not someone would go, that's a lot of people who would be willing to make that decision based on the framing of that term. And so I think this kind of comes full circle with bringing in things like verbal behavior, things like risk aversion, probability discounting, prospect theory, and it's all kind of interacting, and we're seeing it happen, in real time on the news. We're also seeing it trickle in the data. And personally, it's horrifying to open up these data sets and look at it and see that people are making these decisions, and you're realizing this is a behavior problem with a behavioral solution. And we're seeing the effects of that in real time with our data, but you're also seeing it play out with the way that public health messaging is happening. And so it's frustrating as a behavior analyst to know that we have these solutions, and yet there's not much we can do. And so it's a tough spot to be in.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/getCEs. So one of the things I was thinking of, I've seen some headlines here and there of people writing articles saying that, hey, if you go out with your friends, you could kill your grandparents.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm like, well, that's a little hyperbolic,
Yeah.
But it fits the model that you're describing here, though. Like, at least from what I'm understanding, like if you're going to provide a warning, you provide a warning in terms that are graphic, I guess, as opposed to metaphorical.
Right.
Insisting it's just going to be bad, or you're going to increase risk. That's more theoretical or less tangible, I suppose.
Yeah, and so there's the downside to this too is that if you make it too graphic, like you're going to kill your grandparents, people don't believe it because it seems just so absurd. And so there's got to be a sweet spot where you're doing something that sounds realistic enough, but at the same time is jarring enough to kind of evoke that response that you're hoping to evoke in any behavioral sort of intervention. And I don't know what that sweet spot would be. I think we need to do research in that area, and we're woefully behind the curve on that, unfortunately. But I saw a great video of Max Brooks and Mel Brooks, and they were standing on the other side of a window talking to each other. I don't know if you've seen that.
I did.
That actually was pretty good. Yeah, I liked that one, and it kind of hits that same sort of idea that, I'm doing this because it helps him and his friends stay alive, and it didn't come off as like some like crazy sort of emergency sort of scenario. It was very relatable, and so I think that would be an effective use of this concept.
Yeah, and I'll try to run that down on YouTube and include that in the show notes, because if you don't know who Mel Brooks is, and then they mention a couple of other kind of older generation comic types, and so it's one of those things you just kind of have to see it. And I think our attempts to describe that will probably just go down in flames. So
yes,
but it was cleverly done, and so I'll try to put that in the show notes. But the long story short, yeah, basically it was an example of a younger person has the potential to infect older people that he cared about.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I thought that was really well done.
Yep.
So I'm sensing some frustration, in terms of our field's ability to kind of wrangle with some of these issues. In our correspondence, you also mentioned some barriers that we have to understanding these things from our research methods. And I thought that was really interesting. Would you mind sharing that and going into that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, and given the research I do, I get a lot of critiques along these lines quite frequently from other behavior analysts, and it's valid, but I think it kind of underscores a problem. So the way we typically approach what is behavior analysis is what Baer, Wolf, and Risley kind of lay out in the dimensions. And when we think about what's analytical, it's things like repeated measurement, steady state responding, drop in a multiple baseline, and 90% of the time, that's great for what behavior analysts typically do. But now we're at a situation where, for instance, COVID-19 outbreak, we don't have the luxury of extended baselines and running it to some steady state before we implement some intervention. So then do you run the risk of doing what's considered not behavior analysis, because now you're going to violate the dimensions of applied behavior analysis? Or do you go ahead and say, I'm going to do that because it's the greater good? And this is something that comes up with a lot of the research that I do as well, where you're looking at things like tornado warnings, or getting access to a vaccine, or availability of condoms. These are things that are insanely socially important in terms of the greater population, but they don't lend themselves to these sort of Baer, Wolf, and Risley guidelines for what behavior analysis is. And this becomes an interesting debate, because as a board certified behavior analyst, you have to practice within the dimensions of applied behavior analysis. I am a board certified behavior analyst, and I have to kind of come to grips with like what I'm doing and how does that fit into what behavior analysis is or ought to be. And at the end of the day, I think that people kind of miss some of the important pieces of Baer, Wolf, and Risley, which is the applied aspect of it, so social relevance, and that sometimes we really need to do what makes sense to answer and solve a problem. And I don't know how much they would agree with deviating from single case design, but I don't know how else you would do that with, say, COVID-19. How would you look at whether or not people would say, go get tested for COVID-19? Would you really infect them and then have them pull plungers to be able to get a testing kit? No, that's silly. So what can you do? Well, we can do a purchase task. Like, we give them a scenario and imagine, that you have these symptoms, and they're symptoms that we might have all had. But now in the context of what's going on culturally and in the United States, those symptoms now matter. So anchoring people to that in a hypothetical scenario might have some validity. And maybe we should be doing things like that to try to answer these questions and be okay with translating behavior analysis kind of a step further. So there's a lot of talk about translational research in behavior analysis, and the idea that you kind of take stuff from EAB and put it into ABA. there's also research translation, and that we kind of forget about. And that's where you can implement behavioral procedures without saying so true to the dimensions. So for instance, working with county health professionals, put in place some incentives to get tested or remove barriers to testing. That can still be behavior analytic because you're basing it off of decades of research to guide what you're doing. And I think we need to be okay with saying that's also behavior analysis. But what I see happen is that a lot of times these people are branded, if they do that, as being soft behavior analysts, or that's not behavior analysis anymore, to the point where people leave the field and then they end up being incredibly successful in the public health realm because they're taking behavior analytic ideas and doing something kind of bigger with it. And I don't see enough of that happening in our field. And I think that the COVID-19 outbreak is a great example of this. Like what do we have that we can do? What sort of technologies do we have, say, in the pages of Java that we could go to and point to and say, here, public health officials, read this article, and now you'll understand how to help this pandemic. It just doesn't exist because our research methods are incompatible with these sort of crises. And so that, I think that to me is kind of a huge call for perhaps a transition point in our field, which is to really think about what does it take to get the attention of policymakers and lobbyists, and what can we do to say, I'm saying conceptually systematic to behavior analysis, but I'm loosening up other dimensions in order to solve a problem. And that's what I think needs to be done. And I think that we as behavior analysts need to be comfortable with that approach and not brand those people as kind of traitors to behavior analysis. That's not the case. They're translating it to audiences that really, really matter. So that's my soapbox response for that.
I see. Well, I happen to agree with that. So I'm glad.
Good.
Yeah. Let's see. All right. Well, that was well stated. And I think again, if we're I've heard you reference the Pat Fryman's concept of under the dome many times, and boy, there's nothing much more under the dome right now than problems like these that we're facing right now. So
exactly.
All right, cool. Do you have time for I got a couple listener questions. I got a ton of listener questions, actually. A lot of the listener questions were about non-behavioral economic aspects of COVID-19, and those are things I'll try to address perhaps in other episodes. But I've got a couple here. So if you have a minute, we can go through these.
Sure.
All right. So Dave from Ireland, I think we probably may have kind of talked about this in our earlier discussion, but if there's any other thoughts you have, let it fly, as it were. But so here's what he says. Dave says, how can the motivation for the general public to engage in behaviors advised by public officials be increased when there is no clear positive outcome or observable consequence for the individual? I'm thinking about relatively healthy 30-something-year-olds like myself who are unlikely to suffer ill effects but could potentially pass on the virus to someone more susceptible. My thoughts are that we need to quickly create strong, relevant, rule-governed behaviors. And his question is basically, how is that best achieved in a situation like this? Isn't that the $64,000 question?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly. I think, if we think about what it takes to have rule-governed behavior, it's consistent contingencies. And I think one of the big issues, especially in the United States right now, is a lack of consistent messaging. And so, I feel like every day the news is a roller coaster ride on what's actually happening, what the data actually suggests, what our leaders are thinking. And I think that degrades rule governance. We know that people are, you're either going to follow the contingencies or you're going to be rule governed. And when the rules don't seem to be consistent, people are going to go with those contingency shaped behaviors. And unfortunately, if you're a 30-something-year-old who is relatively healthy, then all of those smaller, sooner reinforcers are going to outweigh those probabilistic delayed ones. So yeah, absolutely. Rule governance is what we would need. So I think that's where consistent, effective framing of outcomes is what would be necessary to do this. And I think that, again, also some of these ideas from behavioral economics, we can kind of look at data sets and think about hyperbolic discounting and how that looks. And we can run experiments and try to figure out, like, how do we frame this message the best way? Or what is the appropriate price to put on a testing kit? Or how close do testing facilities need to be from any one citizen for them to be able to go access it? And those are all behavioral economic questions. And so, having some consistency with that and some effective messaging of that, I think would evoke that rural governance that we definitely need to see.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Dave. Shubhata asks, I'm very interested in hearing Dr. Reed's thoughts on the behavioral economics aspect of the way Taiwan has handled the crisis and what we could take and apply in our communities, even if on a small scale. I'm not exactly sure what Taiwan did specifically. I know there are some countries that I think really were able to get a handle on this problem sooner rather than later. So, Shubhat, I hope I'm not misinterpreting your question, but I guess one thing I would take from this is, are there behavioral economic principles that differentiate highly effective versus less effective responses to this particular problem?
Yeah, and I think this boils down to kind of the strength of the intervention that we're putting in place. And right now we keep hearing mixed messages. Like just a week ago, they were saying don't have crowds of more than 1,000 people, and now today it's don't have crowds of 10 people or more. So that's evolved very quickly, but it's relatively inconsistent. And if you're only tuning into the news every few days, that's a huge difference. And so I think that is what might be the root of this question: is how do we get Americans to basically shutter their doors and wait this out the way that Eastern countries have done so? And this brings up an interesting point. In addition to delay and probability discounting, there's something called social discounting. And that's this idea that, would you take a certain amount of money for yourself or forego some money to be able to share it with someone else? And the cost there is social distance. And so Howard Racklin came up with this procedure, and it's this idea of like, imagine 100 people. Person number 1 is person most closest to you. Person number 100 is someone you would pass on the street and not recognize. And then they would basically do discounting at different social distances. So social distancing is kind of an interesting kind of elicited this sort of idea for me, is that when we think about social distancing in behavioral economics, we're thinking about how far away someone is from you and personally. And America is an individualist society, and we're an individualist culture. Eastern countries are collective. And that's just kind of like a meta contingency. These are contingencies that kind of operate culturally. And Eastern countries tend to think of the greater good and putting the group ahead of the self. And it's basically the reverse in the United States. For better or worse, there's pros and cons to each. Now, in this case, if we think about it in relation to social isolation, for instance, Eastern countries may be more apt to do that because you're thinking of that sort of collective response, this critical mass of people all doing this for the greater good. It has an effect. In the United States, we're not used to that. We're thinking about what's doing best for us and not thinking about the greater good. I don't mean to sound negative about American culture. It's not the case. It's just, it is what it is. And so I think when we hear those sort of messages like, oh, think about how you're going to pass this on to your neighbor, that's not as potent of a reinforcer as it might be for someone from a collective society. And that kind of brings us again full circle to the beauty of having behavioral economics within behavior analysis, which is you have to tailor your intervention to the individual. And so maybe these ideas and framing it like, you're going to help the greater good, maybe that's not an effective intervention for Americans. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Maybe we need to approach it differently and have, kind of capitalize on the individualist sort of meta contingency that's operating on our culture to try to nudge that behavior in that way. So this will help you personally with your 401k down the road by you social isolating yourself. Maybe that would be a better approach to get people to follow these public health procedures. I don't know, but I think that would be an interesting starting point. And there is some research on social discounting between individualist and collective cultures, and it's actually the reverse of what you'd expect. And people don't really know why that's the case. But anyways, there is a difference there. So it's a starting point.
One of the things that when I got that question, I started to think about too, is that, the United States is, from a landmass standpoint, is large. It's spread out. We've got 330, 340 million people, so you have a country like Taiwan. I don't know what the population of Taiwan is off the top of my head, but I think of it in terms of like boats, different size boats. Like the United States is like a tanker, like an oil tanker or an aircraft carrier, and some of these other countries may be more like, speedboats, or tugboats, or something that you can turn around and maneuver, with a lot less effort, because there's a lot fewer things to do, a lot less inertia, momentum, or whatever. I always think about that when you're thinking of, about anything. Well, why does this country do it this way? Or, it's like, yes, the small country with, 18 million people. Yeah, that's probably a little easier to affect change, and doing it across an entire country like ours, I think is, it's pretty darn complicated. I think I'm not saying that to like make excuses or anything like that, but I just that the size of the problem is sometimes, I think important to take into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also just the spread of the country, there's, again, discounting. I live in Lawrence, Kansas, and we're pretty far from any hotspot. And so for that spread to come to me, it doesn't seem as salient as it's happening literally down the street or floors below you. People have it. And like that changes the immediacy of the effects. So I think the best analog to this would be New York City right now. And what New York City is facing is kind of like what happened in Wuhan, or what happened in Upper Italy and Northern Italy. And I think that seeing how people react in New York City, with the same sort of, strong concentration of a population, all very close in a small geographical area, we're now being asked to do what happened in, say, like Taiwan or Wuhan. And it'll be interesting to see how Americans respond to that, because it's a very good control, or a very good comparison to what happened overseas. And so time will tell, and we'll see whether or not that's effective for New Yorkers. But it's interesting. And if we think of behavior analysis as being a natural science of behavior, and we think it's the way to solve the world's problems, then there ought to be a solution, and it's there. We just have to go find it.
All right, cool. So KU classes are canceled for the rest of the semester.
Right. Well, they're not canceled. They're online.
I mean, yes. Well, that's thank you for that correction. That's exactly what I want to bring up real quick. And so you'll be teaching online. Have you had much teaching experience online prior to this?
A bit. Fortunately, I've read up a lot on behavioral teaching approaches. So personalized systems of instruction, programmed instruction. And we've developed an online aspect of I teach a large intro to behavior analysis course with 250 undergraduates. And we've automated a lot of it to be kind of via Blackboard, basically using a personalized system of instruction. So kind of go at your own pace, mastery criteria. And so it's an easy adaptation for us to just basically remove the lecture and put up videos of us lecturing last semester, but then keep those aspects the same. So that background is making this an easier transition to me, or for me, than it might be for others.
I see. And it'd be interesting. There's part of, I guess one of the, it's probably premature to think about silver linings, especially when we're talking about people with lives in the balance and the stock market losing, I don't know, 20% of its value, whatever the hell it is right now, whatever.
Right.
But I guess the thing that I'm looking forward to seeing is the adaptations and the ingenuity. Hopefully that we'll see, and it'll be interesting to see how online education evolves and improves as a result of this, and certainly in a broader field of applied behavior analysis. There's going to be a lot of short-term suffering, and hopefully necessity being the mother of invention, that will inspire some solutions that we might not have thought of, and might deliver better service as a result of. So anyway, well, I wish you the best of luck for the rest of the semester and going forward from that. And so, Derek, I know you're really, really busy, so thanks again for taking time out of your day to chat with us and to relate some of these real world problems to some really important behavioral science.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.